So my name is Pavni Divanji, and I work for Sunsoft in the Distributed Objects project. And we have 3 very interesting talks ahead of us, so I won't take up much of your time. And I will not attempt to list the contributions and the achievements of the speaker because the list is very long. So our first speaker today is Dr. Dorothy Denning. She's a professor and chair at Computer Science Department of Georgetown University. And those of us who are familiar with the field of computer security know her quite well. She doesn't need any introduction. Her main area of focus is information security, and today she'll be sharing with us her thoughts and vision about encryption. Dr. Denning.
How many people know what this is? For those of you who don't, this is a Grace Hopper nanosecond. And this is the distance that a signal travels in 1 nanosecond. I acquired this from Grace Hopper in 1971. I was a systems programmer at the University of Rochester, also an instructor in the electrical engineering department. And I had, on behalf of our local ACM chapter, invited Grace to come give a talk at Rochester, and she came, and it was one of the most delightful experiences in my memory. And I remember still picking her up at the airport and driving her to the motel so that she could check in. And when we got there, she gave her name to the clerk at the hotel, and she said, "Yes, that's Grace Hopper. That's Hopper as in grasshopper." And it was just really a very delightful experience. The nanosecond, well, she gives these out, or talks about it when she gives talks. And so this was part of her talk. She also had a microsecond with her. And the microsecond was, as you can imagine, substantially bigger, but it wasn't all that big. It was, coiled around. And she explained also what a millisecond was, how many times that wrapped around the Earth or whatever. And I don't remember all the details, but I have always cherished my nanosecond. She also left me with some very interesting papers, 1950s papers on the early days of computing and the work she was doing. These were papers that she wrote on programming languages and compilers and all those kind of concepts back in the 50s. And I loaned them to somebody here. I'm not even sure who has them right now. They're over there. So if anyone's interested, I think Diane Martin volunteered to make some copies. Okay, anyway, I want to talk about cryptography. And I imagine that probably most of you here in the audience know what cryptography is, but for the benefit of those of you who might not, let me just briefly explain. The idea is that you have 2 people who want to communicate, okay? And we typically refer to them as the sender and the receiver, but if you're doing a phone conversation, which is what I'm going to be talking about mostly here, of course, you're both senders and receivers. But anyway, you want to do this, and you want to do it securely so that nobody can listen in. And this is where cryptography is used, and you basically have the sender who's speaking or transmitting information uses an algorithm to do what's called encryption or encrypt, which basically scrambles up the information or the conversation that goes out over your insecure channel. At the other end, the receiver has a device which unscrambles the communication and restores back to the original message. Original messages are called plain text. The encrypted messages called ciphertext. And then we have like our eavesdropper in the middle who might be listening in. One of the other interesting characteristics of encryption is that in order to do this in a normal context, the sender and the receiver have to share some secret information in advance. And this is called a secret key. And that's used together as a parameter to the encryption and decryption algorithms. So the objective with security, of course, is to protect against this eavesdropper. A few years ago, I really discovered something I hadn't thought about very much myself, and that is that there's times when you actually want to have eavesdroppers, and in particular, if the communications are, if you've got some criminal conspiracy going on and the communications are among people who are criminals or planning a terrorist attack or something, you just might want the government to actually be able to listen in on those communications. And in fact, the government does listen in on communications. Normally it's not a problem because they're not encrypted. So let me give you just a little bit of background about that. First of all, in order for the government to listen in on communications, except for a few exceptions, they have to have a court order to do that. For law enforcement purposes, they always have to have a court order to do that. And to get the court order, they basically have to have a demonstration of probable cause that criminal activity is already taking place. So they don't just go out there and turn on the scanners and say, gee, what's going on out there? Is there anything going on that we should know about? It doesn't work that way, and it's a very elaborate process that they have to go through to apply for a court order and then obtain the court order. It can take weeks of actual paperwork and going through various chains of bureaucracy and so on to do that. They are also, there's also a lot of restrictions and so on what you can use them for and so on, and a lot of cost involved. The average cost of a wiretap performed for law enforcement purposes has been about $45,000. So they're used only really typically in major cases that involve organized crime or terrorism, government fraud and corruption, and so on. In kidnappings, let me tell you one interesting story, because normally when we think about the government doing a wiretap, we think, okay, it's okay if they wiretap the criminals, but I don't want them wiretapping me. And the story is, in fact, I've heard two of these stories now from people I know in law enforcement, is that a guy was kidnapped, and he was taken away by the kidnapper in his own car, which was equipped with his own cellular telephone. The kidnapper used that cellular phone in order to communicate with his cohorts. The FBI got a wiretap order, in this case an emergency order, which they can get. They got a wiretap order, they intercepted the communications, they were able to find out what the plan was and intercept not only the communications, but then go intercept the automobile and save this guy's life. So there's an example, and I tell it only because it startled me, because I, prior to that, had not really thought that, gee, well, there might possibly be circumstances when I'd want the government listening in on my phone. There are fewer than 1,000 wiretaps performed per year. Just in terms of a couple of statistics, your odds of being the target of a wiretap order are 1 in 300,000. The odds of you actually being the target of violent crime in this country are 1 in 50. Well, when I became more familiar with this problem, it really produced a major shift in my research. Because prior to that time, all of my research was focused on providing as much security, as much protection as possible. And so for the first time, it dawned on me that there's other objectives here that we need to think about too. And this is a list of what we might call national objectives. Number one, which I put on here, is secure communications. I mean, we obviously need secure communications for sensitive information. We also, though, need effective law enforcement. We need effective foreign intelligence and national security. We have not only the wiretaps that are done for law enforcement purposes, but electronic surveillance, as it's sometimes referred to, is also used for gathering foreign intelligence information. Some other objectives is that we want to do this in a way so that industry can be successful and so on, maintain economic competitiveness, all the right buzzwords. You'd like the technology to be exportable. Right now, cryptography technology generally is not, although certain kinds of cryptography are. And low cost, readily available so that people have it to use. Well, by the time I really found out about this problem, the government had been way ahead of me, thinking about this problem for a long time, which is not surprising because the FBI and the NSA and so on are all part of the government, and they have these concerns. And so they were working on a more specific objectives that led to the Clipper chip. And their objectives included providing strong encryption to succeed the data encryption standard. Data encryption standard was adopted in 1977, and many people consider it to be nearing its end of its useful lifetime. And so they were looking for a replacement for that. They were looking at all this in the context of a larger picture where you would not only have the capability for encryption for confidentiality purposes, but you would also have the capability to do what are called digital signatures, which provide a very strong way of authenticating information with non-repudiation. They wanted a secure hash algorithm. This is something that's used for data integrity, also used with digital signature computation, and various other things. And so they were in the process of developing this, what's called a Tessera card. It's a PCMCIA card. It was going to have this chip on it, which has been referred to as capstone, and have all these goodies on it. But they wanted to do this in a way such that when the government put this standard out there with this very good encryption on it, it would not, basically, could not be used to shoot the government itself in its own foot. Okay, so they did not want to put out a standard such that then if criminals went and used it, it would thwart their own ability to be able to conduct authorized surveillance. Okay, so the whole objective behind Clipper was not to catch crooks. Okay, it's sometimes presented that way, and if you present it that way, it's not necessarily going to look very successful because criminals would use something else possibly. Okay, but you have to think of it in terms of that the objective was really to put out some very high quality encryption along with lots of other capabilities, and to do all that in a way that would not be deemed harmful to society. So the Clifford Solution, I found out about it the night before it was announced on April 16th, 1993, a year ago. And as I said, I had started thinking about this problem. The government was way ahead of me and came up and announced what they said was their solution, which has become referred to as the Clipper solution. When I first found out about it, I had, since I've been thinking about the problem, thinking about how you would go about dealing with it and providing the capability for both strong encryption and law enforcement access. And when I saw the Clipper solution and looked at it carefully, I thought it was a better solution than anything that I had come up with. It actually addressed some of the difficult issues that I was grappling with and trying to figure out how to deal with it. And so after finding out more about it and looking at it and so on, I became a proponent of it. A dangerous thing to do in this business because Clipper has had lots of people in opposition to it. Let me just say that while I'm a proponent of it, I'm not here to sell it to you. If you want it, you'll have to talk to AT&T. They're selling products that have Clipper chips. But I just want to really explain to you more what it is and also hopefully have some opportunity for a little bit of discussion. There will be, I think on the public policy panel tomorrow, Susan Landau will be talking about the result of a study that the ACM sponsored on cryptography where we looked at Clipper and a lot of the issues, and she'll be talking about, I guess, is that right? The results of that study. So tomorrow. Okay, so the essence of this thing is it's a hardware-based solution. And the encryption is done with an algorithm called skipjack. And it preserves the lawful interception by government officials through what's called a key escrow system, which is separate from the chip itself. It's a voluntary standard. And when the government started this up, they also started up some various committees to continue an ongoing policy review and also look at other possible solutions to the problem in both hardware and software. And in fact, I'm sitting on a working group that was sponsored by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We're looking for software approaches to doing key escrow. So the government is very open to other kinds of approaches for doing all this. Okay, the standard is referred to as the escrowed encryption standard. The standard, as it's specified, is for voice, fax, and data transmitted through the phone system. The algorithm, I'll come back, I have a separate slide on that. So what allows the government to get access to the communications is through something called a leaf, or law enforcement access field. And what happens is that when two people are having a secure conversation over telephone, say, is that in addition to sending out the encrypted communications, each side sends out this leaf. In fact, they send it out in advance of the communications. And this leaf has in it, and I'll show you what's actually in there, has in it the information that the government can then use in order to get access to the communications themselves. The way they get access to the communications also, in addition is through this leaf, is through a key. And this key is actually split in half and stored as split knowledge with two what are called key escrow agents. One is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and the other is part of the Treasury. Right now, that's who they are. The technology is exportable to most places. The initial implementation is in a chip developed by Microtronics. And the initial use of the technology is in these devices, telephone security devices that are produced by AT&T, called the AT&T 3600 TSD, or telephone security device. Okay, the algorithm is classified, so this is pretty much all I can say about it. It takes as input a 64-bit block and produces as output a 64-bit block, which is the same as the data encryption standard. The main difference, as seen from an external point of view, is the key length is 80 bits instead of 56 bits with the data encryption standard. So that provides a lot of additional security just through the extra bits. And it can be used in all the same ways that the data encryption standard can be used. There's 4 modes in which it's used. In fact, as shown like in this picture here, where is not how you would normally encrypt communications. So you don't normally encrypt communications like a block at a time, taking one block and putting it through the algorithm with one key and out coming another block. And so these various modes of operation provide a more complex way of actually using the encryption algorithm to encrypt the communications. But we're not going to go into that here. Okay, so the leaf, and the leaf is what gives law enforcement access. Again, it goes out with the communications. And so here it is down here, and this shows how it's basically created. The communications themselves, when they're encrypted with something called the session key. That's a secret key that's shared by both of these telephone security devices. The telephone security devices decide on what that key is going to be before Clipper even gets involved. And they can do that in a way such that they can generate this random key, and they can do it by just exchanging public information down the wire. And so if somebody's listening in while they're doing this key negotiation process, they won't be able to figure out what key they come up with. And this is a very miraculous way of doing it. And we have Whit Diffie actually in the audience with us today. Whit, raise your hand or stand up. Whit is actually the, one of the co-inventors of this approach to do it. So anyway, to do the leaf, so this session key goes into the leaf, along with an initialization vector that's also used with the encryption. And that session key gets encrypted under a key that's unique to the particular Clipper chip. So each Clipper chip has its own key on it. This is the thing that got split and escrowed with the two separate escrow agents. So it gets encrypted under that key. And then you get, and then it gets, that result gets concatenated with an ID for the chip. And it also gets concatenated with an, what's called an escrow authenticator. If you've been reading the New York Times and various other sources and listening to the radio, you might have been hearing about some attacks on that. I'm going to explain that to you in a couple of slides. Anyway, then that whole packet gets encrypted under something called a family key. The family key is on all the chips. So that then that whole encrypted thing goes out on the leaf. Now, if somebody is listening in on the communications and picks up the leaf, okay, they're not going to be able to get very far with it. You know, normally they wouldn't even have the algorithms or the family key or anything like that. But even if they could back up that far, that session key is encrypted under the key that was on the chip that sent it. And they're not going to know what that key was. So you can't reverse that process and go back and fetch the session key out of the leaf. Okay, this slide here, which I actually got from NIST, shows the whole setup. So we have the two people, top and the bottom, having their conversation. The bad guys up in the upper left-hand corner there, and they're using two of these AT&T devices. And by the way, to use these devices, it's real easy. You just plug it into your telephone between the handset and the base set, push a button that says Go Secure, and that's all you do. Okay, so they have their skipjack encrypted communications going down the left. And then in the middle, we've got like the FBI here doing a wiretap. And of course, all that's tied in with, the whole process here is tied in with the court system, not only to get the court order to have that wiretap installed to begin with, but then when they need to do the decryption, that's also tied in with the court system. Okay, then you've got the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Treasury Department. Those are the two key holders. And so they both get involved in the government access. Then over on the right, what we've got is basically the chips being manufactured. And so you start out with a foundry here where the basic silicon is produced. And then that goes into a chip programming facility. This is Microtronics, the people who are actually programming the chips that are going into the AT&T device. So they program the chips. And the chips, when they're programmed, they get these unique keys burned onto them. And at that time, the splits are given to the two escrow agents. And in fact, the escrow agents supervise that whole process of the chip programming. So those two key, what they're called key components, go to the two escrow agents. And then when the wiretap is installed, so after it's installed and the FBI is listening, okay, then when they discover that they've got skipjack encrypted communications, then what they have to basically do is provide certification to the escrow agents of the authorization for the court order. And they also have to tell the escrow agents what the chip ID was that was in that leaf, okay? And so that the escrow agents can then provide the key components that are needed to decrypt that leaf. This whole process here has got a ton of various kinds of security mechanisms involved to make sure that keys are only released when authorized, and to make sure that they're well protected, and various other things. And time permitting, I have a slide later on that basically goes through all that, but let me just maybe briefly mention here. For example, every place where key material gets touched or accessed, there's always two persons involved. So we've got two people, even inside each escrow agent, are required in order to access these key components. And then, of course, there's two escrow agents that have to also get together to put these components together. In addition, cryptography is used, and computer security, a lot of physical security. Things are stored in double lock safes so that it always takes two people to open up the safes. And extensive auditing, and the auditing is being set up so that somebody from the Department of Justice can go back and look through the records and make sure that all the key releases, in fact, corresponded to valid court orders. And also to make sure that after keys are released and used, that they get destroyed, and so that the law enforcement people can't hang on to the keys and use them later on. Okay, I wanted to briefly mention this attack that's been described recently. I'm losing my voice, I don't know why. But anyway, what the attack does, this is by a person by the name of Matt Blaze. Excuse me. Well, no, I don't think the water will help. Thanks. Anyway, so Matt Blaze at Bell Labs basically came up with an attack that would allow you to basically spoof the leaf. And what that means is that you could set it up so that when the leaf goes out from the sender over to the receiving device, it goes out in such a way that it will be useless to law enforcement. Okay, now, first of all, the attack, I'm going to describe it like with these telephone security devices, and then I'm going to tell you it doesn't work in that context. But since we've been talking about the telephone security devices, let me just describe it to you in that context. And so basically what you'd have is one device, instead of sending out the valid leaf that allows the law enforcement people to get access to the key, what it would do is basically it starts manufacturing arbitrary leafs and giving them to the chip and saying, is that a valid leaf? Because there's something in the chip that will test whether or not it is a valid leaf, and that's what that escrow authenticator is all about. That escrow authenticator is only 16 bits out of 128. And so what you can do is you can start arbitrarily generating these leafs, give them to the chip and say, is that good? The chip comes back and says yes or no. Since it's only 16 bits, after 2 of the 15 of those trials, on average, you'll get a leaf that will be accepted. Okay, and then once you have one that's accepted, you can send it over the wire to the other device, and it will get accepted on that other end. And it's a little bit complicated. I don't want to go into the details of that, but it's basically generating this bogus leaf. Okay, and so the effect of that is it prevents the government from getting access to the section key. So there would be a substitution of a bogus leaf. Okay, again, that escrow authenticator determines it. Okay, now, when he did this attack, he didn't do this with the telephone security devices or with any kind of real-time communication. You can't do it in that context. Reason is because, well, what he did it with was he did it with using these Tessera cards, which have in it the capstone chip. And that has a software interface to it that allows you to basically throw leafs at it and say, is that good? Okay, doing the 2 to the 15 trials took on average 28 minutes. Okay, and that's part of the reason why you can't do that in a real-time application. You don't have 28 minutes to come up with a bogus leaf because the devices, the telephone security devices will time out long before that. Okay, they'll time out like within a second or two if the communication, if the synchronization is not all established. So where the attack has the possibility is in the context with using the Tessera card for like secure email. And there, you know, a 30-minute delay you might be able to tolerate in that kind of environment. There are possible remedies. One is a larger escrow authenticator. Another is to introduce delays so that you couldn't get feedback as fast as to whether or not a leaf was any good. Another possibility is to disallow repeated leaf tests. The main thing is that it doesn't reduce the security of the thing. One of the things I've been working on is, well, one of the concerns that people have is, okay, this is a nice national solution, but what about international? Okay, because the kind of problems that we have in this country where we want both secure communications and effective law enforcement, that's a worldwide problem. It's not just unique to here. So I've been trying to figure out what would be the objectives for an international key escrow system. And some of the ones that I'm looking at, and all this is really in a very preliminary stage right now. I've just enumerated some of them. I mean, it would be nice if we could also find software solutions to this as well as hardware, be able to use unclassified algorithms. The skipjack algorithm is classified. The reason why that's classified is because if that algorithm were just made public, then people could use that algorithm, okay, without the key escrow feature and without the leaf and all that. And the government then didn't want to do that. So they didn't want to make this very strong encryption algorithm with 80-bit keys available for use in a way where they would not themselves be able to get access to the communications. Okay, but a quite interesting question is, could we do this with unclassified algorithms and software? Because it would be cheaper and more flexible. When you look internationally, it'd be nice if there were an international standard, but realistically, I think we have to be able to accommodate different standards. And another thing, optional corporate key escrow. A lot of companies are concerned that they may lose access to encrypted information. Okay, if you've got some employee who is disgruntled and decides to make your keys inaccessible to you, or if keys are lost or somehow accidentally destroyed. So you might want to be able to tie this in with something which would also allow corporations to get access to keys that they used. Various other things, like with a Clipper chip, the keys are actually escrowed when the product is manufactured. You might look at other strategies that would defer that to the time when the product was first used. And then that would allow, for example, products to, say, be shipped to different countries. And then when they got there and were used, they could have their keys escrowed in the country where they were being used. When you start looking at all these things, you also start getting into national policy issues about export, import, and so on of encryption. Who would hold the keys? Who would hold the keys to a product that might be manufactured in the United States but sent to a different country? And the need to really establish various kinds of international bilateral agreements to accommodate that so that you could have the proliferation of the technology, but do it in such a way that it would not be contrary to any country's national interests. A lot of challenging issues and problems.
One of the questions I have, though, and I think this is for all of us in research, is how to pick the question that we work on and whether it's an important one or not. And in the beginning you said that in fact there are fewer than something like 1,000 wiretaps that are given permission for a year. And this seems like an incredible amount of effort to go. I mean, it's very interesting theoretically. Can I do an encryption scheme that's somebody can have access to and somebody else can't. But in terms of the motivation being so that in fact the government can get at it, when in fact there are sort of, on the order of 1,000 cases a year, seems like sort of an imbalance.
Well, in fact, many people would say that, it's not worth the effort. You have to look at those cases. And a lot of those cases, resulted in, indictments of, like 50 people in a major organized crime ring, okay, where they were nailing top people in the ring, okay? And some of the terrorism cases, involved substantial bombings, or there was, one planned attack to shoot down a commercial airliner. This was a group that was operating on behalf of the Libyan government. So there's a lot of cases like that, and there's not really time here to describe any of them. Some people, even when they look at the cases, they say they still don't think it's worth it. And that's a value judgment. From my own personal, values, after talking with people in law enforcement, I became convinced that if we can do this in a way that preserves that law enforcement access without jeopardizing privacy and security, let's do it. Okay, and let's try to find a solution to that. When you look at what's involved doing a wiretap and the money that's involved and so on, you also have to ask yourself, if it's not that necessary, why are they doing it? Okay, they're not doing it, I can tell you, for the fun of it. Because sitting there listening with these earphones on, and they have to do, minimization, they have to turn it off, if the conversation is not on the crime and so on, it's a pain. And I've never met anyone who liked doing it. So they're doing it because they felt that they had to and that the case was important enough to throw that kind of resource on it. Yeah?
I have some problems with the value-laden language that you used, although I'm not sure how you could have gotten around it. We're in the town where Senator Joe McCarthy held the House Un-American Activities Committee meeting. People were blackballed, careers were ruined. This is his town. The FBI put Martin Luther King wiretapped them. They were certainly within the law enforcement community when they did that. G. Gordon, the lady from the Lodge Cabinet, has got a talk show right now. He was working for the President of the United States when he did the Watergate maneuver. Please, I don't trust the federal government to have this kind of power. Can you see the bad guys? All right, that's a real problem.
Yeah, and that's a big issue and a big concern to a lot of people about the whole issue of trust in the government. And I guess, I don't have a real good answer to you, and I've been trying to figure out how I can give a good answer to that question. And I think part of it is that when you look at trust in anybody or anything, and let's say trust in the government, is you don't want to just lump it into one pot. Okay, you've got to say trust with respect to what activity, what domain of action, and look very carefully at what kind of safeguards are in that domain, and is that particular thing designed to protect there? Okay, and you have to, I think, be very specific. Over the years, a lot of the laws have evolved for wiretaps and the procedures and practices and so on to protect against abuses by the government on wiretaps. And oversight committees established in Congress to oversee the national security use of wiretaps and so on. And then in the Clipper system, the design, that system is being designed with what, really incredible attention being placed to making sure that system is not abused. So, that's my best answer, is really trying to dig in there and really being very specific. Because if you just say, can you trust the government, and you throw at me, you can throw at me hundreds of things that the government's done wrong. Okay, but there's also a lot of things the government does right that gets lost in that. And so I think you really have to dig in very specifically. Yeah. Sure.
Well, just to get away a little bit with the problems that you have with your government.
Yes, Canada.
One of the things I find interesting is that you research. How much research is going on in corporate areas where they're worried about espionage? I know that for people in some R&D environments, at least in Canada, that's a significant problem. And yet I don't know how much funding is going on. So is the cryptography research with respect to the industrial applications more or less homegrown, or are they sort of collaborating in any way?
Well, the corporate key escrow is really separate from the corporate concern about industrial espionage. I mean, you can just throw cryptography on to protect your communications. Okay, there is a lot of interest in corporate espionage, and so that's one of the reasons, in fact, why you want to use cryptography and other forms of security. It's also, you know, corporate espionage involves a lot of stuff other than eavesdropping. Okay, your biggest threats are typically, you know, somebody on the inside selling information out, or somehow, you know, somebody being able, you know, getting a mole inside the company or whatever. You know, traditionally those, and I think still continue to be actually your more serious kinds of threats. But yeah, I mean, that's why you need cryptography. That's why it's a tough problem, because you want that strong protection.